and him alone. And then in Galatians 6 and verse 1 it says, when you see a brother overtaken in any trespass, you who are spiritual, restore such a one in gentleness. And when spiritual, I think he's talking about those of us who are sitting in this room, those of us who are Christians, and those of us who are trying to live the Christian life. So it's our responsibility to go to this person and try to restore this relationship as far as we're concerned. Now, he says do it in gentleness. And I think maybe that, maybe what he's saying is, well, don't go to this person and make an accusation against this person and say, well, you did this and you did that, and therefore you hurt me or you sinned against me. I think he's saying, both of you need to come together in an understanding, and let's talk about this situation. Let's talk about what took place, and let's talk about what both of us need to do to restore this relationship. Because, if we don't, then, it may not get restored. Because if we go with the wrong attitude, then we may end up having more of a problem than we did before we went or before we started. Jesus, I think, is saying in this relationship where he's talking about restoring this relationship between people who have differences, I think he's saying if you come to worship and there's a problem between yourself and another person, I think he says maybe your worship is vain. Psalm 66 and verse 18 says, If I regard iniquity in my heart, the Lord will not hear. Now that verse says, if I regard iniquity in my heart, the Lord will not hear. And I think maybe the interpretation of that is that, if we got that problem, we're not doing anything about it, maybe the Lord's not listening to our prayer. Maybe it's not getting out to be said like it needs to be said. Now, I don't know all about this subject, so if some of you people want to speak up and add some light on this, then, I'll be glad to listen. John 4 and verse 20 and 21 says, If a man say, I love God, and hateth his brother, he is a liar. For he that loveth not his brother, whom he hath seen, cannot love God, whom he has not seen. And in verse 21 it says, And this commandment have we from him, that he who loveth God love his brother also. And sometimes maybe we deceive ourselves when we fall short of doing this thing, because the right thing and believe that an act of worship. Some people say, well, if I got this difference with a brother and I go to church and we pray about it and we sing about it and the preacher preaches a good sermon about how the kind of life we live, sometimes people think everything's okay. Well, that sermon and that Lord's Supper and you sitting and singing those songs and listening to that prayer is not going to correct that relationship of anger between two brothers or differences between two brothers. If we don't do something about it, then Isaiah 66 said, our worship is in vain. And so we must put first things right with others before we can be right with God. That's what John 4, verse 20 and 21 says. If a man say, I love God, and hateth his brother, he's a liar. For he that loveth not his brother whom he hath seen cannot love God, or his brother whom he has seen cannot love God whom he has not seen. Tough words, many sayings of Jesus are hard. We'll talk some more about some that may get harder as we go through this lesson. But restoring the relationship is important. And the last part of those verses talks about taking someone to court, and that's the second solution to the situation sometimes that exists between brethren. But Matthew 25 through 26 says, let me find my notes again. Come to terms quickly with your accuser while you are going with him to court, lest your accuser hand you over to the judge, and the judge to the guard, and you be put in prison. And truly I say to you, you will never get out until you have paid the last penny. Now that's talking about a relationship of brother and brother going to court, which is not good as far as the cause of Christ is concerned. But these verses, Jesus is talking about in a situation where an offended person begins legal proceedings against the one who is offended. And Jesus says, that this should be solved at the point of disruption, and it should be solved outside the courts and not be allowed to fester and grow. And Christians, if they're Christians, should be able to work out these differences without resorting to legal actions. And when it does happen, and a brother takes another brother to court, then the cause of Christ suffers, because Jesus tells us here, you need to solve these things outside of court. Brethren do not need to go to court against one another. They need to settle it outside of court, because I think it shows the attitude of somebody who's a Christian going against another Christian. Matthew 27 through 30 says, we jump from settling an agreement between two people to the situation of people who might commit adultery. And Jesus said, you have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that whoever looks on a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery within her heart. Now, when Jesus said, thou shalt not commit adultery, he was quoting from Exodus, the 20th chapter and verse 14. In Exodus 20th chapter and verse 14, it says, thou shalt not commit adultery, which was part of the Ten Commandments. But when you look at the relationship and what this word is talking about, adultery is defined as having a sexual relationship in which either or both parties is married to someone else. And adultery was a serious offense under the law, and it was punishable by the death of both the man and the woman if they were caught in this relationship. Leviticus 20 and verse 10 says, if a man commits adultery with the wife of his neighbor, both the adulterer and adulteress shall surely be put to death. Now, I'm sure there are a lot of people living today in adulterous relationships that are glad that that verse has not been forced today, because it says both of them shall be put to death. But it's a sexual activity outside of marriage, and it's the breaking of a solemn vow. It's a vow to one's spouse, which is made in the marriage ceremony, and then, most importantly, it's a vow to God, because you made the vows before God and said, this is what I'm going to do. This is how I'm going to live in this relationship. And when you commit adultery, then you've broken that vow. And so, but in Psalms 51 and verse 4, David had been in a relationship with Bathsheba, and I think you could say that David committed all the things that Jesus was talking about as far as an adulterous relationship was concerned. Because the Bible tells us that David walked up on the roof and he saw this woman and he wanted that woman and he sent for her and they committed adultery. So I think you could say that what got David in trouble was the looking and the lusting and the committing sin. And when you look at in Psalms 51 and verse 4, David said, against you you only have I sinned and done what is evil in your sight. And so David was telling God here in this writing of Psalms 51 and verse 4, what I've done was wrong. What I've done was evil. What I did was sin. And it was evil in your sight. Now, what Jesus is condemning here is the one who yearns for a sinful relationship, I think. The condemnation is not for the person who meets the temptation and rejects the temptation. But the condemnation is the one for who seeks it, who desires it, he wishes for it. He looks at the woman for the purpose of lusting after her and trying to create a sinful relationship. Now, the devil knows all about sexual temptations. And he knows how to entice people to sin as far as sexual relationships are concerned. And you can read the book of Proverbs, and there are long passages in the book of Proverbs that talk about a foolish person who would seek an adulterous relationship or a lover and then fall victim to the enticements of adultery. And the fact today is that we probably are more enticed than maybe the people under the book of writings of Proverbs are concerned, is because if you turn on your TV, then you can see movies, or you can turn on your computer, or you can turn on your cell phone. And you can see all kind of things that the entertainment industry is trying to get you to lust after these things and let this lust lead to sin. And the entertainment industry has spent a great deal of money for these things. They spend a lot of money to put these videos together and these movies together and this music together. And the entertainment industry makes it where you can see it. I dare say if any of you were to turn on a cell phone this morning and look for it, you could find something on that cell phone that you shouldn't be looking at. And same thing with a computer. And sometimes some of this music that people listen to is one of the ways that the devil is leading people to sexual temptations and lustful eyes, and then leading these people to sin because they carry out these things. And I'm going to interject this, and Jesus didn't say it in these verses. But parents have a great responsibility today to know what their children are seeing and what they're hearing on these devices. Because, as I said, they can find all kind of stuff on that cell phone. And you can see from little bitty ones all the way up to people as old as I am has got a cell phone. And there's nothing to prevent, oftentimes, because a lot of parents don't do anything to try to keep that stuff from being in their cell phone or on a TV or on a computer. And so the children see these things. And parents have a great responsibility to see these children do not see these things, to let them think about these things. Because Christians have the responsibility that they should avoid any and all things that war against the soul. Because the theme throughout the Sermon on the Mount and the theme throughout all of Jesus' teaching is that both righteousness and sin originate from the heart. We can think about righteous things, we can think about good things, but we can also think about bad things, sinful things, and all of it originates from the heart. Jesus said in Luke 6 and verse 45, the good person out of the good treasures of his heart produces good, and the evil person out of his evil treasure produces evil. For out of the abundance of the heart, his mouth speaks. And so, whether it's right or whether it's wrong, it comes out of our heart. And so we have to be very careful as to what we look at and what we put in to our heart, because these things originate in the heart. Our idea of being good and our idea of being a Christian, our idea of living right and helping people and associating with the right kind of people is in our heart. But the devil knows that I can get you. The devil knows how to get you. He knows how to get me. He knows how to get Brent. He knows how to get everybody sitting in this room, because he's a master at it. He's been doing it ever since in the Garden of Eden. And he continues to do it all down through the ages, and it continues to go. And it appears sometime to us today that, well, maybe it's getting worse. And it probably may be because there's so many ways and so many avenues that people can go as far as sin is concerned. In James 1 and verse 13 it says that let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one. But each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. And the desire, when it conceives, gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death. And so when Jesus said, whoever looks on a woman to lust after her hath committed adultery in his heart, James says in verses 1:13 through 16, that's how it starts. It begins as a desire, and a desire, when it's conceived, gives birth to sin, and sin, when it's fully grown, brings forth death, or brings forth the situation that these people go past the lustful state and then they commit adultery. At this time, we're going to sing a song, and the name of it is Yield Not to Temptation. And Gary, what's the number? 798.
798. Yield not to temptation, for yielding is sin. Gentry will help you some other to win. Fight manfully over dark passions subdue. Look ever to Jesus, He'll carry you through. Ask the Savior to help you, comfort, strengthen, and keep you. He is willing to aid you. He will carry you through. Shun evil companions and language disdain. God's name hold in reverence, nor take it in vain. Be thoughtful and earnest, kind-hearted and true. Look ever to Jesus, He'll carry you through. Ask the Savior to help you, comfort, strengthen, and keep you. He is willing to aid you. He will carry you through. Who can overcome? God giveth the crown. Through faith we shall conquer, though often cast down. He who is our Savior, our strength will renew. Look
We've talked about relationships and restoring relationships among people who have differences. We've talked about adultery. We've talked about temptations. But in Matthew 5, verses 29 and 30, maybe the hardest two verses for many of us to realize that this is what we need to do. But Matthew 5, 29 and 30 says, if your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. For it is better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body be thrown into hell. And then verse 30 says, if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. For it is better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body go into hell. Now, I don't think you can say that Jesus is really telling us that we have to mutilate ourselves, we have to gouge out one of our eyes, or we have to cut off our hand. But he is saying, if it's necessary for you to prevent sin, then you need to make some changes. Now, Jesus was serious, I think, when he made the statement, if these parts cause you to lose your home in heaven, then you need to make some changes. And I'm not sitting here this morning telling you got to go gouge out your eye and you got to cut your hand off. But I think Jesus is telling us in these verses that we need to remove anything in our life that interferes with us making it to heaven. And last Sunday, when we talked about the rich young ruler who came to Jesus and he asked Jesus the questions, what I need to do. And then when Jesus told him, you need to sell what you have and come follow me, then it says that he went away sorrowful, for he had great possessions. Now, I think the message for us in that account is that some statements that Jesus made are hard. But if we want to get to heaven, then we may have to make hard decisions. Because if whatever's in our life that's preventing us from living the kind of life that's going to make it to heaven, then I think Jesus is telling us, you need to do something to change. It may be the people you associate with. It may be where you work. It may be difficult sometimes to say, well, I really don't want to give these things up. But oftentimes, these things interfere with people making it to heaven. And if it's interfering with them making it to heaven, then Jesus is saying in these verses, you need to get rid of these things. You need to get these things out of your life. And so, he made hard sayings. A lot of times for people outside the church, it's a hard saying when he tells them you need to repent and be baptized, because they don't want to make that change. They don't want to do that. So not only is statements hard sometimes for people outside the church, sometimes statements in the church, these statements are hard for us. Anybody got any questions or comments? Neil?
When it says if your eye or your hand causes you to sin, as we've just noted and as he points out, it's your heart, not your eye or your hand, that's leading you to sin. You have to change your heart. And as you pointed out, it may mean giving up some friends, giving up some hobbies, giving up some entertainment that you like. It may be giving up some places that you go. It may be simply avoiding temptation in whatever it is in your life. And sometimes that's harder to give up than it would be to cut off a hand or gouge out an eye.
Okay, thank you. Okay, that's all I got to say. Y'all are dismissed.